The truth, or rather the weaponization of the truth, is what I would like to discuss with you. The weaponization of the truth. And I take my lead, or at least the point of departure that I take, is a very long and a very detailed discussion in Foucault's Abnormal. Now, in general, I find this one of the most significant books that was ever made. And one of the very rich elements in the book is how he develops an argument about discourses of truth, all right, that growed through the 19th century, the early 20th century. And for instance, he illustrates at the end of the book how racism, for instance, has become, in a society like ours, a discourse of truth. Now, what is a discourse of truth? A discourse of truth is a discursive constellation. In other words, a set of ways of speaking, if we now turn it into an ethnographic sort of jargon, by means of which generally, socially, socioculturally, but also institutionally, we expect the truth to be transmitted. So in other words, if you want to be recognized as a person who speaks the truth, you have to speak the truth in a particular way. Okay. Now, historically, there were two big regions, let's say, two big areas of, let's say, discourses of truth. One was religious, the other one was rational and scientific. We start with the religious one. It's the oldest one. For many centuries in the West, you spoke the truth when you spoke it in relation to the Word of God. So the truth was the ultimate absolute truth was actually a religious notion, right? And it resided in the way in which you, for instance, as an individual, articulated the Word of God. So the truth, the big discourse of truth, was a religious thing. Now, this wasn't sort of abstract or individual thing, okay? No, it was also institutional and it was collective, all right? It was not a thing that you had to do for yourself or purely for yourself. It was also an element of social structure, if you wish. There is a very beautiful book. I think it only exists in French. It's a beautiful historical book. And one of the elements in that book is the history of religion and truth, or at least the connection between the two, the institutional connection between the two. And one of the points that the author makes is that for a very long time, if you wanted to be a witness in a trial, all right, you could only be a witness if your religious credentials had been established. So in other words, if you did not believe, all right, or if you were in a state of sin, for instance, you could not be acceptable as a witness, a credible witness in a trial. Right? As a consequence, infidels, so people having a different religion, I think of Muslims, right, could never be a witness in a trial. Why? Because they could never speak the truth. You could only speak the truth when you had the right religious credentials. So a very, very strong set of discourses of truth that had their feet in religion. Okay. The second big block is discourses of truth that were organized around rationality, around a sort of an early scientific idea of the truth. Of course, this is the more recent sort of development. It's a thing here in the West that we very strongly associate with enlightenment. So the period in history in which modern science emerges, but even more so in which we begin to think about the truth on the basis of facts that exist outside of us, all right, and that can be observed by multiple people in the same way, all right, and that in that sense have a sort of undeniable reality. And that's the foundation of science, right? The undeniability of a level of reality that is observable, that can be investigated by multiple people. So if we summarize these two big blocks of, let's say, discourses of truth, had a number of features. Okay, they were external to the individual, in the sense that both God, but also facts, rationally established facts, are not individual things, they're collective, all right, and also institutional. Institutional, for instance, if you look at the rational paradigm, if I can say it in that way, of course, that sort of rationality was then institutionalized in systems of education, in the genesis of research as we now know it, but also in media. So this idea that media are objective reporters of the facts also has its feet in that particular tradition. So that's the sort of the general point of departure. We have these big traditions of speaking about the truth and of being recognized as somebody who produces a discourse of truth, right? But these two traditions persist; they haven't gone. And in fact, still, if you would look around, you would see that discourses of truth are hierarchical, right? So for instance, scientific discourses generally, and I will qualify that in a moment, but generally have a pretty high status when it comes to establishing the truth, right? If a statement is grounded in hard science, for instance, using figures or using a particular methodology that can be repeated, and has been checked as to the requirements of methodology, then it ranks pretty highly in a hierarchy of discourses of truth. It's hard to deny. And then, of course, if you would try to challenge it, it would be seen as irrational and a bit of a fool, actually, a bit of an idiot. It's the same on the religious side, let's say. All right, the word of God is hard to challenge. And so somebody invoking the word of God within that world where that really counts, okay, hierarchically, that again would rank very highly in the field of, let's say, discourses of truth. So far, so good. We have a long tradition, as it still persists today. But over the past number of years, one of the very significant phenomena that we've been witnessing are phenomena for which we have a sort of shorthand definition. We usually label them the culture wars, right? And they have to do with a new sort of media environment, online, offline. And one of the features is, that they are strongly directed at key values of the tradition of Western thought, right? And they make very sharp sort of distinctions there. And in the culture wars, what we see is that the truth, okay, of which I said that we have very long traditions, very well established, traditions of creating it, of making it, of accepting it, of circulating it, of discussing it. The truth itself is the central object of the culture wars. And that's what I mean by the weaponization of the truth. The notion of the truth itself is under attack, non-stop, and in a variety of ways. And in what follows, I would like to describe one very widespread development, that we see in the field of the discourse of the truth. They are fundamentally changing. Okay. And now we have to move into a world that's familiar by now. For instance, the world of the discussions on the climate and how the climate changes, right? And then more recently also the world, in which we have these big discussions on the coronavirus, on what it is, what it does, where it comes from, why we ought to protect ourselves, and so on and so forth. I think these two big debates, and they're quite recent. I mean, they have defined a lot of the public debate over the last handful of years, certainly the climate debate, and then more recently the debate over the coronavirus. I think they provide very, very good illustrations of exactly that. There are also actors, that immediately come to mind. Of course, is Mr. Trump, but he's not the only one. You also have online platforms like 4chan, Breitbart, and what have you. And so there is a world now in which multiple, let's say, new discourses of truth are circulating, all right, and a number of them have the following features. First important feature is the derationalization of the truth. Okay. Now we have to return to what I said earlier. The long tradition in which one of the robust assumptions about the truth was the truth is rational. And in hierarchies of the discourses of the truth, rational, so let's say science or minimally fact-driven argument, ranked very, very highly in the hierarchy of the discourses of truth. Right. One of the things we now see is the derationalization of the truth. There are multiple people who who use the argument that rational discourses, scientific discourses, okay, are in themselves proof of lies. Okay, so those who use science as a basis for argument, for arguing that they speak the truth, right, and that an argument is undeniable or should have a legitimacy in these hierarchies, that is pretty high, very, very, very high, and very hard, to debunk. That those people, all right, are liars, and that they use science or a rational sort of argument and a rational sort of discourse specifically to mislead us, specifically to construct a lie that many people would agree with, okay, would believe. And so this is one of the arguments you see very, very often, and you see it, for instance, articulated very strongly in conspiracy theories. So yes, they try to tell us all of this, but the reality, the truth is an entirely different thing. And you never read that in the media, okay? So here is one important new feature, the derationalization of the truth. Okay. Now, what replaces this rational truth is moralization. The truth becomes a purely moral notion. And not just a purely moral notion, but an individual moral notion. Okay. And I return to this dimension of individualization in a moment. But the important thing of the moralization and the derationalization of the truth is that the notion of a fact, an established fact, a fact, that we have created, for instance, through scientific investigation. The notion of a fact is just, if not irrelevant, it's definitely not a decisive element anymore. Hence, discourses about fake news, yes, or about lies. So, for instance, a politician would openly produce a lie, would be attacked by the fact checkers, and the response to that would be, it might have been true. So maybe it isn't immediately true, but it's a scheme. It's a scheme of things, that might have been true. It could have been true, right? And another thing that we very often see is that the moment you point to the absence of facts, all right, but the answer here is Well, of course you wouldn't show our facts, right? That's why you keep them hidden. Think about also the discourses that are being made, produced, circulated in the anti-vaxxers circles, or the people who believe that the planes produce these chemical trails, the chemtrail conspiracy theorists. So the absence of evidence, the absence of factually established arguments in their favor is used exactly as an argument to say, of course, they would never, offer that evidence to us. They are withholding the evidence from us, which is why we speak the truth. Moralization of the truth. And that brings us to the point I already mentioned. So you have moralization of the truth, so the derationalization, if you wish, but secondly also the individualization of the truth. I said earlier that the truth, historically, traditionally, had a non-individual dimension. By its very essence, the truth was collective. For instance, the word of God is not an individual thing, it's collective. But the same with science. Science is collective, right? And if a bunch of scientists show on the basis of their methodologically checked procedures that the world is round and not flat, okay, this is a statement that is not individual, it's collective, right? And it's also offered collectively for everyone, to accept. Now here, so we have derationalization. The second sort of dimension is individualization of the truth. The truth, well, essentially, the truth becomes an identity, all right? You are a true person, which is why you can only speak the truth, all right? And the others are, bad people, bad intentions, wrong camp, and so on, which is why they could never speak the truth, right? So it becomes an identity position. The truth becomes an identity position. And it's very, very closely, intertwined with other very, very widespread notions like he's real, he's authentic, or she's authentic, notions of integrity, honesty, and so on and so on. A good person speaks the truth, regardless of whether he or she would be backed by facts or contradicted by facts. He or she is a good person. As a consequence, he or she would speak the truth. And so the truth becomes an identity label for the good people, those who are on the right side, all right? And they are being, let's say, defined by the truth, okay, which makes them really good, very good people, the best people, okay, and which makes their individual qualities as being, the good people unchallengeable, because it's true. They are the bearers of the truth. Okay, so far so good. Let's now very quickly bring that into a couple of, a very superficial way here, with a couple of illustrations. I'm going to start with the climate debate. One of the strange features in the climate debate is the alliance that has grown over the last couple of years between, on the one hand, school children, all right, and on the other hand, hardcore science, right? So on the one hand, you have researchers in labs, and researchers doing field work in Antarctica or the Arctic or whatever. And on the other hand, you got school children led by individuals, very young people, like for instance Greta Thunberg, 17, 18 years old, all right? She's an unlikely speaker of the truth, okay? But she's authentic. So you have a moralization dimension here. And she operates in an alliance with the rational tradition. And so here in the climate debate, you see an interesting sort of fusion between this new weaponized conception of the truth as moral and individual on the one hand, and so in alliance with a very traditional, rational, institutional, and also collective, non-individual notion of the truth, and they form a sort of an alliance. They're opposed to people like, for instance, leading politicians, but also industrial lobbies. All right, and one of the features of industrial lobbies is that they also produce science. And so here again, you see how the formats are being mixed, blended, and in a way paradoxical. Just a footnote about lobby science. A very, very long tradition in which lying, all right, lying at a certain level also had to proceed through science. There's a word for it, tobacco science. And it goes back to, earlier decades in which the tobacco industry would hire researchers or buy research that would basically demonstrate that smoking wasn't harmful, that a number of the claims that had been made medically about the effects of smoking had no grounds, or were weak in evidence, or were challengeable, and so on and so on and so on. So here we saw the power of the discourse of truth. Even if you want to say to lie, a good lie had to look like the truth. It had to look like an established, rational, academic, scientific argument. But so let's now return to the climate debate. You see these two mixed coalitions in which, on the one hand, you have, let's say, traditional, rational approaches to the truth that are research based. Now, admittedly, they're out of balance in the sense that the Greta Thunberg group, let's say, has more science behind it than the climate denials group, or those who call themselves climate realists, and so on and so on. So the rational instruments for the production of the truth, but also the moralized ones. So those who don't believe, or those who believe very, very strongly, like Greta Thunberg and her many, many, many thousands of school kids all over the world who've joined her movement. So here we see, a battle over the truth, in which different new discourses and old discourses of truth interact, and in a way, they convene, not always in a sort of easy or harmonious relationship, but they do. That's my first example. Second example is, of course, the debate about the coronavirus, which has basically the same structure. What was so interesting about the corona crisis and the lockdown measures that were imposed in so many parts in the world was that the entire show was led by science, and almost every leading politician in the world would argue that he or she would be led by science. Right here, we as politicians, we have no say. We have our scientists, basically dictating what we have to develop in the way of measures to contain the virus. So, hierarchically, the rational enlightenment sort of idea of the truth prevailed very, very, very strongly. However, gradually we began to see how here as well, all right, the truth about what the virus was, what its origins were, how it would be transmitted, how this how the transmission might be slowed down or prevented. Little by little, this robust scientific discourse was mixed, blended, and interfered with by Again, a completely different set of discourses that were driven by belief, all right? Belief articulated by leading politicians like Mr. Trump, but also, for instance, let's say President Bolsonaro of Brazil, who still calls it a flu, right? And there are still many people who have their own, truth about the coronavirus and specific measures, like for instance, the social, let's say, distancing. There is no evidence, that it needs to be 2 meters between individuals. 1.5 is also good, and even 1.5, there is evidence that 1 meter would be enough, and so on and so forth. It's the same with wearing a face mask. Yes, no, yes, no, there's evidence for this one, but there's counter evidence there, and so on and so on and so on. So here again, we see, and I think it's very, very interesting, we see basically two paradigms of discourses of truth, not just interacting, but locked in serious battle with human lives as at the center of the debate. Okay. Now, in conclusion, when we think about the weaponization of the truth, we need to be aware of the fact that the truth, which is a robust notion, or used to be a robust notion, right? Either it's true or not. And if it's not true, it's a lie, all right? And if you produce a lie, you are a liar, meaning not a good person, right? Now we need to be aware of the fact that the robustness of this notion of the truth is no longer there, and that we are now facing a multitude of conflicting discourses of truth, all right? A number of which look ridiculous, and Foucault would say ubuesque, like ubu-roi, this absurd figure from the late 19th century theater, meaning a leader, somebody who becomes the leader of a country, but has no features that would basically make him into leader. He has all the features of the opposite. A number of these new discourses of truth are ubuesque in that sense. They're absurd. They are ridiculous. However, they're very strong, right? They're very strong. And since they're driven by belief again, and since they have now been individualized, it becomes very, very delicate, to challenge them. Because a challenge to them reveals you as an individual, as a bad person, as a liar, as somebody who doesn't want to do good in society. That's not a nice place to be in. Let's be aware of that. The battle is on.